Okay, we now move on to our final theme for the entire A2 Christianity course. So if you've been following all these PowerPoints through with me, this is the end of the road. So theme 4F, it's entitled Christian Responses to Poverty and Justice, but in particular what this theme is really looking at is liberation theology, which started in Latin America, so South America, Brazil, Peru, Argentina, those sort of areas. It's got strong links to Roman Catholicism because that is the main Christian denomination in those areas. And really this theme is looking at is liberation theology compatible with Christianity and the Roman Catholic Church? And it looks at the work of two liberation theologians, which are Gustavo Gutierrez and Leonardo Boff, as well as his brother Clodovis, but it's mainly Leonardo Boff. So let's introduce you to the theme. So liberation theology, as I said before, started in Latin America in the 1960s. It really started all with this man here, Gustavo Gutierrez. He's a Peruvian priest, theologian, and he wrote this highly influential book called Théologie de Libération, a theology of liberation, in 1971. And basically what he said was that theology, how we interpret God, how we come to a relationship with God, or the study of God, should start not from some sort of intellectual, rational thought, but rather start with human suffering. And he thought that when Christians start to take seriously all the oppression around them, they'll be moved to fight for justice. So what he's saying, it's not enough just to rock up to church every Sunday, say your prayers, sing your hymns, do your confessions, and then walk out into a world where there's poverty, injustice, etc. Something more needs to be done. Okay? So liberation theology is calling all Christians to see that their salvation includes fighting for social injustice, or fighting for social justice, fighting against social injustice. So it's not good enough for a Christian, as I said before, just to attend church and walk out into a world where there's slavery, death by malnutrition and injustice. It's simply not acceptable. So Gutierrez contrasts liberation theology with modern European theology. So if you think about where we are in Europe, Gutierrez would say that we are in a world that's come of age. We've got scientific, technical progress. And so all the theology that's coming around in Europe is making for a case for God in the face of the challenge from atheism. It tends to be more intellectual and rationalistic. So that is a different context, a different worldview perhaps, to how things are in Latin America, where the context of liberation theology is not of combating atheism, is not of putting a rational spiritual case for God. It's actually in the context of people dying from social injustice, lack of food, poverty, etc., etc. And liberation theology came about from the pastoral work of priests in Latin America who were seeing this suffering in the shadow of technical and scientific progress. And these two people, Leonardo and Clodovis Boff, who are both Brazilian priests and indeed brothers, say that liberation theology is actually a result of faith, the Christian faith, confronted by oppression on a day-to-day basis. And their influential book was Introducing Liberation Theology. So liberation theology is not merely just about reforming political structures. For Gutierrez, it's about abolishing that status quo, abolishing the society that's led to the suffering and replacing it with a different set of relationships, particularly to the production and the economy. And so this is where there's definitely a Marxist socialist view here that is linked to how you restructure society so that there isn't inequality and the poor aren't being oppressed. So it has a political edge. And because it's got a political edge, it's been a target of criticism by many Christians. And in fact, the Roman Catholic Church has not been short in having a right pop at liberation theology, although it's got better recently. And of course, governments as well don't like it, particularly the American government. Certainly when the Republicans are in, definitely don't like it, because any government that is anti-socialism, is anti-communism, is not going to view liberation theology in a very favourable light. And this quote from Gutierrez, I think, says it all. The cries of the oppressed keep rising to heaven more and more loudly. God today goes on hearing these cries, condemning oppression and strengthening liberation. Anyone who doesn't grasp this has not understood a word of liberation theology. So it is about evening up society, getting rid of poverty, getting rid of hunger, freeing people, liberating people from social injustice. So I mentioned it's got a political basis. So it's important to understand how issues arose in Latin America. So it grew out of a brutal situation which faced many people in Latin America who basically have been exploited financially and economically for over 500 years at the hands of colonial powers who've invaded, stripped the resources and used them for themselves. So Spain, Portugal and Britain all have been guilty of doing that. And it would be true to say that as these occupying forces used Latin America, used the continent of South America for their own ends, the church brought Christianity to those countries, but the church was frequently associated with that ruling class, with the elite, with the landowners, and not so much the poor. And this carried on for, as I said, hundreds of years until the 1950s, where it was hoped that we would start to see some economic development within the Latin American countries as they started to develop, become less reliant on imports, and were starting to produce their own goods for national use and were starting to export internationally. And it was hoped that by participating in the economies of the richer West, all people would benefit, by indulging in world trade. Poverty would be eradicated, people would get richer, society would get better as a whole. So Latin America would become more like the West. However, in a capitalist society, the demands are that goods and labour are cheap. And so the result was, what happened in Latin America, the middle class did not develop. So you had at the top very, very rich, and at the bottom very, very poor, and absolutely no one in the middle. So basically, rich, small percentage of the population, they own all the factories, they own all the companies, they own all the land, they've got loads and loads of money, they're incredibly well off. Right at the bottom are the poor and the impoverished, and they are equally, that nothing's changed them. They think things are going to get better, and they haven't. So there's talk of economic aid packages. Liberation theologians really don't like those that much, because they just argue that that just maintains the status quo, that keeps those workers in poverty, it keeps them passive. It doesn't actually change the situation. Liberation theology is about changing the society, changing the way the society is structured so that the poor are no longer oppressed. So you can see some of these flaws in this economic development if you look through history. So you can go to 1954, where the CIA actually overthrew the government of Guatemala. The government had been democratically elected. The CIA came in, they backed a load of rebels, which overthrew the democratically elected government. And the reason they did that was it was motivated by the US wanting to protect the big fruit company that had its interest in Guatemala, mainly exporting bananas to the US, so the CIA, thinking that this company would not benefit from the new government, which was implying that some of the wealth should be shared out amongst the poor and not be given to America, came in and they just kicked the ruling people out. And you've got this picture here which shows that. I'll let you read that at your leisure. And of course, when that happened, this actually played into the hand of socialist and communistic movements. So people like Fidel Castro in Cuba, Che Guevara and others. And in the 70s, some priests inspired by liberation theology actually took part in the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua. And this then influenced rebellions in Mexico and Colombia, where one of the actual main guerrilla factions in Colombia was led by a defrocked Catholic priest, a priest that had been thrown out of the Catholic Church. And there have been executions and assassinations of bishops, priests, church workers across Latin America in this violent context, because also the rich landowners in the countries where liberation theology is prevalent do not want to relinquish their grip on the land, on the control, on the money. So liberation theology is seen as a threat, and quite often liberation theology has been stamped out very violently indeed. So although most liberation theologians such as Gutierrez haven't promoted violence, there's little doubt that they have been sympathetic to socialist and communist movements and ideas, because they see that the capitalist models that basically have been going on in the West for all this time haven't helped the poor. All they've done is help the rich. And many bishops in Latin America have been open to liberation theology, particularly in Brazil. And in 1968, Latin American bishops met and issued a statement which urged action by the church on behalf of the poor. So they denounced institutional injustice and institutionalized violence. And they were actually believing that they were acting in accord with Vatican II, which we've talked about in numerous other presentations. Vatican II, this idea of the Catholic Church becoming more relevant to society, making a priority of helping the poor. And here's a picture of the bishops in Latin America, and Pope Paul VI was present as well. So what's the religious basis for liberation theology, for Latin American theology? Let's have a look at that now. So you can use numerous examples from the Bible. A good one to use is the Exodus account. So the whole of Exodus chapters 1 to 14, where God hears the cries of the Israelites in slavery in Egypt and frees them to this promised land, this utopian land of milk and honey, where they will establish a society free from misery, free from alienation. So the whole of the Exodus account can be used there. I've referred to this in numerous other PowerPoints. All of the prophets who constantly criticize social injustice, as well as people who just turn up to worship and don't actually do anything about the poverty that's surrounding them. So you could use, for instance, this quote from the prophet Micah: "What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, to walk humbly with your God?" That key bit there, do justice. So you can use the prophets. If you want to use direct quotes from Jesus, you could use anything from the sermon, his first sermon in Luke 4, where he says, he's anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He's sent me to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. And that's the prophecy about the coming Messiah in the nativity passages in Luke. In Matthew 25, Jesus talks about the future judgment of humanity will be based on those who've helped the poor. That's the parable of the sheep and the goats. So you can quote that one as well, and I've got my little picture of it up here. When did you see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger needing clothes or sick or in prison and didn't help you? He'll reply, I tell you the truth, whatever you didn't do for one of the least of these, you didn't do for me. Then you'll go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. So that's the parable of the sheep and the goats, which you can use to justify the biblical basis for liberation theology. You can look at Acts chapter 2, verses 43 to 47, which we've looked at in the early church in Acts in a previous PowerPoint. which shows certainly a free and liberating church community which practices a form of communism. They sell their possessions and goods, distribute the proceeds to all as any that have need. So as we get into our last PowerPoint here, we're starting to bring in lots of other stuff synoptically from different themes, and they're all pertinent here. 1 John 4, 20 to 21 makes it very clear that you can't love God without loving human beings first. So another good passage there. So what Gutierrez says, these passages and many others, so that salvation, being saved, isn't divorced from history. It's not divorced from the time that we live in. God's work through the prophets, through Jesus, through the apostles and others to bring freedom to humanity in historical situations, just as we should be doing exactly the same in our historical situation, bringing freedom, bringing liberation to those that are oppressed in these areas of the world. So we then start to look at the personality of Jesus himself. And of course, any study of what Jesus is like, his personality is Christology, how he is divine, human, etc., etc. So liberation theologians look at Christology and they say, well, what's happened is the Christology of Jesus, an emphasis has been placed on the wrong aspects of Jesus's personality by the church. So the emphasis has been on the images of Jesus that place him outside of history and reinforce a more passive attitude to human suffering. So you see the helpless dying Christ on the cross, the helpless baby in the arms of Mary, and the King Jesus who stands outside, detached from the world. And of course, liberation theologians say, well, these are the images that are used by governments to support their policies. And contrary to these images, liberation theologians would say Jesus didn't preach about his divine identity or the church. He presented the kingdom of God as an inclusive society committed to justice, and that is what we don't have. And Gutierrez sums this up perfectly in this quote. The first and primary aspect of following Jesus is proclaiming the utopia of the kingdom as the real and complete meaning of the world that is offered to all by God. And what Gutierrez is really talking about is a perfect society, a perfect kingdom of God, where there is no suffering, where there is no miracle. There is no, what am I saying? They're not miracle. There is no suffering, there is no hunger. Everyone is equal. So three aspects of Jesus' life stand out for liberation theologians. And they would argue that all of these aspects reveal some sort of political dimension to Jesus' ministry. So a Christ that's active within history, campaigning for social injustice, helping the poor and oppressed. That is what theology is all about. And so the first thing they highlight is Jesus' relationship with the Zealots. Now, the Zealots were a nationalistic Jewish group. They were committed to a violent revolt against the Romans, and we know that there is at least one zealot amongst the 12 disciples. So although Jesus may not have been as fiercely nationalistic as the zealots, because certainly he accepted the Samaritans, which the zealots certainly didn't, and Jesus didn't advocate violence, turn the other cheek, etc. The fact that he's got some zealots, or he associates with zealots within his disciples, must mean that he's got some sort of shared aim with them, such as the liberation of humans from systems of suffering, the oppression of the Romans who are stripping the land bare, oppressing the poor, oppressing the hungry, oppressing the needy. Secondly, liberation theologians look at Jesus' rather critical attitude towards the religious leaders of the time, especially when they're making excessive demands on the people. Jesus condemns excessive legalism. We refer back to the Old Testament prophets who criticize anyone that's allowing social injustice to happen. So again, the idea that Jesus was there to change society for the better. And then finally, Jesus' death at the hands of political authorities. You know, Jesus was perceived as a threat to the Roman authorities, the ruling classes, the rich elite. Therefore, says Gutierrez, we shouldn't be spiritualizing Jesus, you know, just as this sort of this being that is outside of time and space. He's a real present force within history, a force for change. So, although Jesus fought for liberation, it would be true to say that he didn't organise this movement for the long-term application of love and justice in society. From what we've seen before, it's very clear that the disciples felt the end of the world was coming pretty soon after Jesus' death. And Gutierrez backs this up. He says, for this reason, you know, obviously he was affected by his culture's belief in apocalypticism. You know, this idea that God is coming, the world is about to end, the kingdom of God will be here. But as we know this didn't happen, Gutierrez says, well, what we've got to do, we've got to apply Jesus' attitude and teaching to the task of building a less oppressive society. That's what we should be doing as Christians. And also Gutierrez says, well, if you look at the eschatology in the Bible, if you look at this idea about the end times and where it's all coming from, Jesus didn't advocate, oh, just don't do anything because the end times are coming. Actually, he advocated doing stuff. You know, one changes stuff, you transform your attitude and you do stuff. Your actions speak louder than words. And that's very clear in Jesus' preaching. So therefore, Gutierrez is saying here, just because it was set, Jesus' message was set in an eschatological, apocalyptic time, it doesn't mean that his teachings aren't relevant. In fact, if anything, just because that end time hasn't come, we've got to change stuff and we've got to do what he says we should do, which is change society. Actions, deeds, help the poor. And this then leads us on to the difference between orthodoxy and this new word which you're going to need to use in any essay that you do on liberation theology, orthopraxy. I'm going to spend a bit of time explaining what that means to you now. So if you think of traditional theology, which I've touched on briefly already, it really starts from the basis of intellectual thought, and it's seeking to find out the truth. What is right? What's the correct way of looking at things? And orthodox just means right teaching. So you find out what the right teaching is and you apply it to life, and that is an intellectual action. It's something one does in the mind. So for Gutierrez, that sort of implies that becoming more religious involves devoting yourself to study, withdrawing to a monastery to contemplate the Bible or theological themes. It's an intellectual pursuit. Now that for Gutierrez is not acceptable. He says for centuries the church did nothing to help the world, and what it was doing was it was involved in creating and reinforcing itself as this superstate, Christendom, where the Pope was in charge of everything. And Gutierrez believes that what's needed now is to see the churches, and by churches he means those local churches, rather than the monasteries, the academies, the cathedral. They shouldn't be where theology happens. It should be those little local churches in the pastoral situation, because it's in those pastoral situations where the church encounters human suffering. And when you encounter that human suffering, that demands a response. And Gutierrez calls this response to human suffering praxis. So it's the practical application of faith applied to life. So orthopraxis replaces orthodoxy. It's not about right teaching, it's about right practice. When you see someone starving, how do you respond? How practically do you respond to that need of your fellow human being? And it's really clear that Gutierrez has been influenced by the Marxist view that what's most important is finding the truth in one's actions. Because for Gutierrez, theology should not begin from this concrete intellectual starting point, but it comes from a situation. You discover the truth, you discover what it means to be truly Christian through praxis, through practicing, through responding to social injustice. So what's the ethical basis of Latin American theology, of liberation theology? Well, the chief concern of liberation theologians, as I'm sure you've realised, is the suffering caused by poverty and economic exploitation. And it's true to say that this is an area of concern for the Vatican as well. Pope John the 23rd declared that the Church is called to be a church of the poor. And as I've said previously, this concern is reflected in the documents of Vatican II. And Vatican II urged the church to walk in poverty. In other words, following the example of Jesus, who identifies with the poor. And Gutierrez says it's really important to distinguish between three kinds of poverty. Your first one's material poverty, which is consistently condemned in the Bible, because it's outside of God's plan for humanity. You know, we've been made in the image of God, therefore we should not be living in poverty. Everyone should be equal. But it would be true to say that some people put a somewhat romantic spin or paternalistic spin on this idea of being poor. All blessed are the poor, the simple life, it's really good. And of course that notion's been rejected, because there's a growing social consciousness across the world that poverty is wrong and that all oppressed people are called to live more fulfilled and more full lives. And that's linked up, that view is linked up with the thoughts of this guy here, Archbishop Oscar Romero, who said many people would like the poor to always say it's God's will that they're poor. It's not God's will for some people to have everything and others to have nothing. This cannot be of God. Of course, Oscar Romero, liberation theologian, and he stood up for the rights of the poor and was assassinated while celebrating Mass for his trouble. Looked like it was a US-backed death squad that did it. You can read the details there. So anyway, back to Gutierrez, three kinds of poverty. We've looked at material poverty. There's also spiritual poverty. And that's more about the inner attitude of being completely ready and available to do God's will. So, alluded to this already, sometimes material poverty has been confused with spiritual, meaning that poor people are thought to be more spiritual than other people, i.e. they haven't got the distractions of material things, they're closer to God. And that's been a popular interpretation of Jesus's quote in the Beatitudes in Matthew 5, where he says, "Blessed are the poor." Now this interpretation, you know, saying that, oh, the poor are blessed because they don't have material things to worry about, therefore they can concentrate on God. For liberation theologians, this is appalling. This interpretation simply serves the interest of the rich minority. The liberation theologian would say the true interpretation of this phrase, and Gutierrez would back this up, is that Jesus saw his task as liberation and promotion of a community of justice, the kingdom of God. So those who are poor had a good reason to be happy, a good reason to be blessed, because their poverty was about to end. Thirdly, Gutierrez talks about voluntary poverty. And this is the act of the church choosing to be poor so it can identify with the poor, so it understands what it's like. And this is very close to what we looked at in the very first theme when we looked at the nativity stories, this idea of kenosis, self-emptying of Jesus during his incarnation. Christ chooses to become poor in order to relate God's love and justice to the human race. Now, Gutierrez notes that something amazing happened also in the book of Acts with that early church when it comes to volunteer its goods to everyone's welfare. Everyone actually had enough. And that's back to that PowerPoint we did on the early church in Acts. So voluntary poverty whereby one can identify with the poor. Now, we've looked at religious, ethical, political dimensions to some extent of liberation theology. And actually, you can't really distinguish them all from each other because they're all interwoven in some way through praxis, I suppose. But what can be clearly seen by liberation theologians is the subject of poverty. This is the key. So a liberation theologian might well pose the question, why are people poor? And they would also note that there are political answers to this question. And some of these political answers to the question, why are people poor, actually are related to this idea of maintaining the status quo of capitalist exploitation. So one of the reasons why people are poor is capitalism wants them to be poor. But, okay, and this is, I suppose, some of the answers have been put forward by the Western society. Some might argue, well, people are poor because of vice. People are lazy, they're wicked, they're ignorant. Therefore, your solution to that is just offer economic aid because they can't be trusted with more than that. Or you can say, poverty is the result of economic or social backwardness. Therefore, make reforms, adjustments to the system, more education, employment opportunities, etc., etc. Now, liberation theologians are going to disagree with all of those solutions because they would argue that poverty in their countries is the logical outcome of cheap labour and goods, which is part of the requirements of capitalism. So just bunging economic aid in is not going to solve the problem. Just making the odd tweak, the odd reform, is not going to solve the problem. It is the system itself that is the problem, and is the system itself that needs to change. So that is the capitalist exploitative system that needs to change for liberation theologians. So only a dramatic change in the system can lead to a better life for the poor. That is the only solution if you are a liberation theologian. And so how do you achieve this change? How do you achieve this change to society? Well, liberation theologians have coined this phrase, preferential option for the poor. And it started to be used in the 1970s. It was embraced by the Catholic bishops in Latin America, and then it was taken up by the Vatican. Pope John Paul II, Pope Benedict XVI also used this term. So it's now become an integral part of Catholic social teaching. So even though the Vatican has not yet accepted the political and economic analysis of Gutierrez and other liberation theologians, it has embraced this idea that the poor need to be prioritised in the commitment to social injustice. Now, that doesn't mean that others are excluded from concern, but it does mean that Christians must make a choice to prioritise the needs and concerns of those who are poor. Now, Gutierrez uses some biblical justification for this because he says, if you think about it, the poor are on the lowest rung of the ladder of society. And God's teaching is that the last shall be first. So basically, one should be thinking about changing the lot of the poor, because this teaching represents the ideal, but it's also a challenge to the church, because most people on this earth are living in poverty-stricken countries. The poor are in the majority. And this then leads us onto the work of, moving away from Gutierrez, onto the work of Leonardo Boff. And he talks really about base ecclesial communities. Base ecclesial communities bring together many of the themes important to liberation theology, praxis, the struggle against oppression, and the Christian faith that's informed by a belief in a God who wants justice in the world. Now, base ecclesial communities are small groups of about 15 to 20 families who basically meet together to support one another, read the Bible, and apply their insights to their struggle against oppression. And they developed from the 1960s onward as a result of basically two factors. First of all, in Latin America, there was a movement in education which brought together smaller communities for literacy and skill building. So it was trying to educate the lower classes. And some of the governments in Latin America were very suspicious of this because they thought that enabled the poor to vote and to take a more active interest in their future, which meant that the poor might overthrow the rich, which they didn't want. And secondly, and perhaps this is probably from a religious perspective, a greater reason for the start of base ecclesial communities, there was a massive shortage of Roman Catholic priests. They just couldn't get enough in South America. So a shortage of priests meant that lay membership of the Catholic community had to take over some of the work that priests would normally do. And what was happening was other denominations such as the Pentecostal church, evangelical churches, were spreading across Latin America and starting to absorb Roman Catholic Christians, especially in areas where there were no priests, where there wasn't that basis, that rock, that foundation of the religion in the community. And Boff gives a story to illustrate this. He shares a story which is commonly associated with the beginning of these communities. Here's the quote. It says, "It all began with the lament of one humble old woman. Christmas Eve, all three Protestant churches were lit up and full of people. We could hear them singing, and the Catholic Church closed and dark, because we can't get a priest. A question hung in the air. If there are no priests, must everything grind to a halt?" Well, Boff, in his book, Base Communities, Ecclesiogenesis, the base communities reinvent the church, he shares how the Latin American bishops quickly supported the formation of these small communities led by lay leaders, so people who weren't ordained, who weren't priests. And the number of these communities exploded through the 60s and 70s, with 1 to 2 million people participating by the 1980s in Brazil alone. And of course, each of these three words, base, ecclesial, community, have significance. So if you think of the word base, that refers to the nature of these communities. They're the basic building blocks of the church. Small groups of Christians are exactly the people the church sees should be prioritised, the poor. When we go to ecclesial, in that they've got a link to a wider church, ecclesiastical is to do with the church. So when there's a priest available, they look to the church for the celebration of sacraments. So if baptism needs doing, weddings, Eucharist needs doing, then a priest, if available, will conduct them. Otherwise, they're left to their own devices. And then communities, because there's sharing not only of faith, but of all of life. It's mutual support. It's a quest to build a better life. You're stronger together. And of course, sometimes they also function as treatment centres for malnutrition, disease, etc., etc. So generally, base ecclesial communities have been accepted by the Vatican as valid expressions of the church. There's that proviso there. They say, providing that they're centred on the Word of God, they avoid a hypercritical attitude towards the larger church, they maintain a link with the wider church, and they remain aware of the benefits of their link to the Church of God. So very much still, we're in charge, but we're going to let you get on with it a little bit. But let's not forget, you're still bound to Rome. So for Boff, these communities are the most important building blocks of the church. So even though they originally sprung about from a situation where you didn't have enough priests, he actually starts to think about this, and he asks, well, should the entire church simply be transformed into base communities? And his answer is that, well, yeah, the church needs both these small communities as well as the larger structures to support and serve them. The larger church, without doubt, needs the small communities to renew its faith. And he says that the larger church also needs to take these communities more seriously and not dismiss them. So for Boff, there are two models of the church. You've got the church as the grand institution with its services and resources, which tends to be concentrated in cultural centres in affluent areas of society where it enjoys social power. Or you have the church that's centred in the network of basic communities composed of the poor masses on the margins of power. And for Boff, it's this model that's the important one. In this model, the institutional church sees its main task as serving these communities. That's what it's all about. And there's been some criticism of the church, because liberation theologians go beyond just championing base communities. They also see that these highlight some of the deep problems within a church that's institutionalized. Both Gutierrez and Boff see the church as having been relatively open and inclusive until about the 4th century, and then it became part of the political establishment under Constantine, when Constantine, the Emperor Constantine, made it the state religion of Rome, and then everything changed. So Boff and Gutierrez argue that when Constantine converted the Roman Empire to Christianity, when he made Christianity the state religion, that's when we had ecclesiocentrism. Everything became centred on the church. So to be for or against Christ was now interpreted as being either before the church or against the church. And so basically you started to have a focus in church life that was on hierarchy, sacred powers, dogmas, rites, traditions, clericalism, etc. And in this institutional church, Jesus was transformed from a suffering servant into an emperor, from a priestly power to a priestly power on a throne. And that's how the Pope then eventually becomes thought of as God on earth. So as the church became a conservative force, attempted to protect its power rather than seeking to bring real solutions to human liberation. So instead of focusing on the poor, focusing on changing society just as Jesus was doing, due to this ecclesiocentrism, the church has now become inward looking, focusing on itself, much more interested in keeping its power, keeping its hierarchy, etc., etc. So what's the solution? Well, for Boff, the solution to all this is found in the Trinity. So within the Trinity, you've got these three distinct persons. You've got the Father, who's the ultimate mystery, the Son, who communicates the truth of that mystery, and the Spirit that shares the mystery with the world. And these three, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, live in perfect fellowship, koinonia. We've looked at that expression before, where each shares in the life of the others, but retains their own uniqueness. And for Boff, humans, because they're created in the likeness of God, therefore are mysteries, but therefore they should also have a koinonia which is marked by both individual uniqueness and perfect sharing, so equality for all, the resources are shared for all. And Boff doesn't think this is the case. He says if you look at your institutional church, it denies participation and equality to the majority of men and women because they remain oppressed and permanently marginalised. It's organised, but it's not organised along Trinitarian grounds or lines. It's not taking this Trinity view in it. It's a much more monotheistic line. So you've got a single church body, a single head, the Pope, a single Christ, a single God, the concentration of all power in one person, the sole representative on earth, the Pope, of the sole God. It's all one, not three in one. And so what Boff advocates is the solution is abandon the paternalistic attitude of the church, submit all of its strength and power to the service of all people, because only by doing that do you fulfill that Trinitarian model, that model of the Trinity. And that then leads us on to whether liberation theology is Marxist, communist, socialist, for whatever better word we want to use it. Okay, so Marxism is the name given to the ideas presented by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and in the Communist Manifesto, Marx says that historical change comes about not by the actions of individual heroes and leaders, but change is driven by the ongoing conflict between the upper class, which he calls the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, those that own the property, and the lower classes, who he calls the proletariat, which are the working class. And it's that class struggle, and the root of the conflict lies in economics. The upper classes are ruled by self-interest, and they see the lower classes only as a means to increase their wealth. And they often employ brutal means to ensure that their wealth is maintained. So we can look at the assassination of Oscar Romero, for example, as an example of that, the CIA coup in Guatemala as an example of that. What's required, according to Marxism, is a dramatic change to a classless society in which everyone works harmoniously to serve the greater good. And the only way to get that is to maintain the ideal is for the tools of economic production to become common property, so that every person can work to their capacity and consume according to their needs. So that is Marxism. Now, when Gutierrez wrote A Theology of Liberation, he doesn't really talk about Marxism that much. He does focus on how capitalistic models of development exploit the poor, in contrast to God's will for society. So Gutierrez observes in the book the creation of two classes in Latin America: those that are dominating, which are the rich, and those who are dominated, the poor, the oppressed. And he comes to the conclusion that those who are poor will not discover a better life through capitalism. So for him, the answer lies in socialism. And although he doesn't mention Marxism per se, he does make a statement that does appear to be endorsing Marxist ideas. And this is what he says: only by overcoming a society divided into classes, only by installing a political power at the service of the greater popular majorities, only by eliminating the private appropriation of wealth created by human toil, can we build the foundation of a more just society. That does appear to be agreeing with Marxist ideals. Boff points out that Pope Paul VI did distinguish between four types of expressions of Marxism and put his own views through on the subject. So he says, if you think about Marxism, four areas: it's a historical practice of class struggle. And so Boff says, well, look, Christians and Marxists do share the dream of a society that's neither rich nor poor. They also share a strong desire to fight against the kinds of class oppression that create an unjust society. The only difference is Marxists view that fight as being a fight to the death, and Christians would believe in first using non-violent means, because the oppressors too are made in the image of God and therefore need to be saved as well. Secondly, Marxism is an economic and a political practice. So you can look and see and assess the results of Marxism. It's true to say that liberation theologians are critical of the Soviet form of Marxism, especially when it turns into bureaucratic tyranny and suppresses individual liberties, as it did in Russia before the fall of communism. There's little doubt that Marxism is also an atheistic and materialistic viewpoint, so it doesn't have any emphasis on the spiritual at all. Bob just says, well, Christians simply reject that part. The atheism that accompanies the Marxist model, just reject it. You don't need it, it's not that important. And it's this fourth one that's key, I think, for Boff. It's a form of social and material analysis. So for Boff, Marxism is a branch of science which looks at society from the viewpoint of historical materialism. It looks at how society has been shaped by history and the capitalistic way of thinking. So Boff believes that any truth that science reveals is God's truth, because God created the world. So Marxism should be valued because it criticises capitalism and proposes that a more socialistic society has the potential to be more humane, and that must be a good thing. So overall, liberation theologians feel that the answer to the poverty that they encounter is to be found in some form of socialism. They agree that the experience of capitalism in Latin America has had disastrous results on the environment, created a class system, and generated a humanitarian crisis. But of course, because they have these socialist leanings, it hasn't always been popular with the authorities. So let's have a look finally at how the Roman Catholic Church has responded to liberation theology. So to start off with, liberation theologians are claiming that their views are actually a logical extension of the God revealed in the Bible and in church traditions, particularly Vatican II, which urge that theology needs to become more relevant to daily life and the poor need to be prioritised. We know that in Latin America, liberation theology was strongly supported by two key conferences of bishops, in Medellin in 1968 and at Puebla in 1979. Roman Catholic archbishops as well, and we know that the Pope was present in Medellin in 1968. The bishops of Medellin said, because all liberation is an anticipation of the complete redemption of Christ, the Church in Latin America is particularly in favour of all educational efforts which tend to free our people. A deafening cry pours from the throats of millions of men asking their pastors for a liberation that reaches them from nowhere else. So, without doubt, there's some support in South America. At the Vatican, liberation theology has had a mixed reception. So in 1975, Pope John Paul VI wrote a document on the theme of evangelization, Evangelii Nuntiandi, and in it he emphasizes the importance of spreading the gospel, of preaching and teaching and giving the sacraments. And he acknowledges in this work a link between evangelism and human advancement. So he says in it, how in fact can you proclaim the new commandment without promoting injustice and in peace the true, authentic advancement of man? So he's saying there needs to be justice, there needs to be peace, otherwise you can't proclaim the gospel, which would seem to be agreeing with liberation theologian views. However, without doubt, Pope John Paul VI was concerned about the potential of liberation theology to reduce evangelism, to reduce religion to social justice, and that's all, and ignore the spiritual and eschatological dimensions of salvation. So for Pope John Paul VI, the primary thrust of evangelism is spiritual and preparing for the future. And he felt that liberation theology was losing those elements, those dimensions. And he also condemned any use of violence to bring about social change. And then along comes this guy, Cardinal Ratzinger, who later became Pope Benedict the 16th. And he expanded on the criticism of the Pope. And he wrote a document called Instruction on Liberation Theology in 1984. And whilst he recognised the validity of liberation theology, since human freedom from oppression is one aspect of salvation, he made several criticisms of liberation theology. So firstly, he said, liberation theology is deluded if it believes that a structural or economic change can bring about salvation. The reason he said it is because sin is a larger issue than just challenges caused by the economy, by economic structures. He said, if you look at history, it teaches us that those who fight for liberation in turn often end up becoming the oppressors once they're in power. And that's why spiritual solutions, not social solutions, are needed. Secondly, Ratzinger argued that Marxism is not a science, but it's an atheistic ideology. And therefore, for a Christian to get involved in Marxism meant that you were basically you've got some terrible contradictions, as he calls them. And he says, well, basically you lose theology itself. The Marxist conception of praxis says that the truth can only be known by being involved in a class struggle against the upper classes. And that then denies the transcendent nature of truth that's part of Christian theology. You know, the spiritual is got rid of. Ratzinger also made the point that Marxism makes everyone an enemy who's outside of the fight of the poor and the oppressed. And actually Marxism encourages violence to bring about change. And that's not an ethic that reflects Christian principles. He also says that liberation theology tends to give the Bible only a political interpretation. So you interpret the Exodus as part of a political liberation. You've missed the whole point of Israel's relationship with God. And actually, if you look at it, the Exodus does not end suffering. The Israelites continue to suffer even after they're in the promised land. And God continues to provide spiritual liberation and purification. So Ratzinger thinks that liberation theology is a bit deluded there. Ratzinger then went on to write an essay on the subject of eschatology. And in that he said it's delusional to think that a historic golden age can be established by political means, this utopian society that liberation theologians are looking to create. In the Bible, the expectation of a perfect world, that comes outside of history. It's brought about by God at the conclusion of history, eschatologically, in the end times. So one of the main reasons that these utopian schemes fail, such as liberation theology, is that they're placing their trust in a new institution and they're ignoring the management or the need for management of the forces in the human soul. So what Ratzinger said was the management of forces in the soul determined the fate of the community much more than the management of economic means, so it's inward rather than outward. And finally, my last slide for this entire A2. The current Pope, here he is, Pope Francis, who is from Latin America, he's Argentinian. He's spoken out strongly about greed, materialism, and the evils involved in capitalism and capitalistic excesses. As a young priest and leader in the Jesuit order in Argentina, he was actually a harsh critic of liberation theology, and actually he sought to prevent priests from involvement in political organisations. And he said, instead of doing that, you should devote yourself to acts of charity and encouraging others to do the same. However, later on, when he became assistant bishop in Buenos Aires, the capital of Argentina, it is reported that his views on priests involved in social justice has softened. In 2015, he invited Gustavo Gutierrez to the Vatican as a guest of honour. I think this is him shaking Gustavo Gutierrez's hand on Gustavo Gutierrez's 90th birthday. And although Pope Francis has never proclaimed himself as a liberation theologian, some of his statements appear to be influenced by a similar kind of social awareness. Just look at what he says here. Some people continue to defend trickle-down theories which assume that economic growth encouraged by a free market will inevitably succeed in bringing about greater justice and inclusiveness in the world. This opinion, which has never been confirmed by the facts, expresses a crude and naive trust in the goodness of those wielding economic power and in the sacralized workings of the prevailing economic system. Meanwhile, the excluded are still waiting. Hopefully you've got a feel for liberation theology now. You can look at the strengths, the weaknesses, its history, what it's all about. You've got an understanding of Gutierrez and Leonardo Boff. Hopefully you've enjoyed these PowerPoints. Good luck in the exam. I hope you get an A grade or even an A star.